Thank you very much, and welcome to the second installment of The Incredible Decade. This concert is entitled Beethoven Reflected, and the reason for that is that Mendelssohn's early string quartet in A minor, opus 13, in many ways reflects his preoccupation with late Beethoven string quartets in their themes and particularly in their compositional processes. And although this particular quartet appears second on tonight's program, I will talk about it third in order so that we can see the ways in which it reflects the Beethoven quartets opus 95 and opus 132, which we will also hear on tonight's program. The concert and this conversation will begin with the Serioso quartet in F minor, opus 95 by Beethoven. And in the interest of full disclosure, I will tell you that this was composed in 1810, so it actually predates this so-called incredible decade by a full 10 years. The reason that it's on this program is that Mendelssohn himself once called it Beethoven's most characteristic work, and in many respects it predicts what was going on in the last five string quartets, particularly in its extreme concision and also in its extreme conciseness. Those are the same thing, aren't they? Contrast, that's what I meant to say. I will tell you what was going on in his life at the time that he wrote this piece. Around 1808, he was invited by King Jerome Bonaparte of Westphalia to become his Kapellmeister. And he thought about this rather deeply because he was always concerned about his finances, and this was a fairly lucrative offer. And he had three friends, three patrons in Vienna, Princes Kinsky and Lobkowitz and Archduke Rudolph, who simply couldn't stand the idea of losing him to Westphalia. And so they made him a counter-offer. They offered him 4,000 florins per year in an annuity to stay in Vienna. And he thought it over and decided that that was the thing to do. And so for a while, he was feeling quite flush. He was feeling like his financial worries were over for a while. And this feeling of security lasted for 6 weeks, at which time Napoleon's armies massed outside of Vienna, and they unleashed a bombing campaign, which lasted for 2 days. And this sent everybody in Vienna running to their cellars, and Beethoven ran to the cellar of his brother Caspar. And there he spent those 2 days with pillows over his ears, trying to protect what was left of his already severely damaged hearing. At the end of 2 days, the Viennese surrendered. The French marched into Vienna. They occupied the town. They levied taxes, and there was inflation which devalued the value of the currency and, of course, the value of this 4,000 florin annuity that he had just been granted. So he was rather despondent about that. Around the same time that he received this annuity, he began to think maybe this was a good time to pursue getting married again. He was now 40 years old, and I think he felt that if he was going to settle down and have a family, he had to do it soon. But he had a long history of falling in love with women who were, in one way or another, unsuitable or unavailable or simply uninterested in him. And at this time, he did that again. He fell in love with this rather fancy-looking woman whose name is Teresa Malfatti. She was the cousin of his doctor, she was a piano student of his, and she was typically uninterested in marrying him, although she did respect him, of course, as an artist. He was oblivious to her lack of interest in him, as usual. She pursued him, he pursued her, he proposed to her, she turned him down, and of course this just exacerbated this tailspin that he was in. And so he wrote, over the course of 1810, 3 pieces that I think in one way or another reflect what was going on in his public life, in his private life. The first of these 3 pieces was the incidental music to Goethe's play Egmont, which is about the actual Count Egmont, and it he's the man who foresaw the liberation of the Netherlands from Spanish tyranny. And I think in this story, Beethoven must have seen a metaphor for what was going on currently in Vienna there, and the Viennese desire to throw off French occupation. It is a piece that begins in dark, lamenting F minor. This is the traditional key of lament. And it is a dark depiction of this Spanish tyranny in the Netherlands. I'll play you the opening of it with a picture of the actual Count Egmont that you can contemplate. In its arc, in its trajectory, this story traces the same arc of his opera Fidelio, from dark, tragic music to bright, heroic music at the end. And at the end, the music suddenly turns over into a bright, joyous F major coda, which sounds like this. So tuck that away for future reference, because when we talk about Opus 95, it becomes a feature of this. After he had had the premiere of Egmont, which took place in June of 1810, he went on to write two pieces of chamber music which were diametrically opposed to each other in every way. One of them was his piano trio in E-flat major, subtitled the Archduke Trio, dedicated to his beloved patron, Archduke Rudolph. And it is noble and expansive and warm and just benign in every way. It begins, I'm sure you will recognize it, like this. And if this warm, benevolent music really represents the civilized, well-behaved side of Beethoven, his superego, the F minor quartet that he was writing at that same time must represent his unleashed id, the other side of his personality, all of the pent-up anxiety. It is in every way the opposite of the Archduke Trio. The Archduke Trio is expansive, and it is in this very large concept, this expansive mode. The F minor quartet is in every way compressed and harsh, and it is the shortest of any of his quartets, and it is also a piece that is based on a signature interval, which is that of the half step, or the minor second, this re, do, this groaning, moaning, sighing interval. We hear it everywhere. Immediately after this spasmodic opening statement that we just heard, there is a quick pause, and then we hear that statement again, ratcheted up a half step to the so-called Neapolitan key of G flat. And out of that, we hear rising from the cello arpeggios that bubble up from underneath. And then we have a sequence of ascending, imploring minor seconds in the violin. Once again, this groaning, sighing gesture. And the music goes careening back into that violent, spasmodic first gesture in F minor, and then he immediately cranks it up a half step to G flat, and then ratchets it up again to G natural. And then immediately we find ourselves catapulted without any transition whatsoever into this more benign and ecstatic key of D flat major. And here we have a more lyrical, yearning theme, which we hear first in the viola, and then we hear it in the cello, and then the second violin. And at the same time, this first violin is again peeling away from the other three and going up into the stratosphere, looking down on them like a guardian angel, perhaps. So this tells us a bit about what we mean when we call this piece an emblem of contrast. This first movement and much of the piece itself vacillate back and forth between these moments of pugilistic violence and between this more yearning lyricism. And at the end of this short, intense first movement, the music just collapses in a heap like an exhausted street fighter. And the second movement begins pretty much where the first one left off in this cello solo. It's 4 bars long, and it has this panting quality as if from the exertion of the first movement. And it is in the cautiously optimistic key of D major. But in this piece, optimism is not the mood of the day. This optimism ebbs away, and we find ourselves in a much more tonally ambiguous world, an almost Schubertian world where we vacillate between major keys, minor keys. There's this indecisive quality to the music. So we have come a long distance from that pugilistic world of the first movement. It's like Rocky has now morphed into Hamlet all of a sudden. And we move rather quickly into the second theme, and this is a dark, melancholy D minor fugue. We hear it first, the subject in the viola, and then we hear it in the second violin. And as you will see, it is entirely laced again in this sad interval of the minor second, and I've circled them so you can watch them as they go by. You'll see it is just a sea of red circles. And this movement doesn't really end, it just dissolves, it dissipates down to a single octave between the cello and the first violin, and then it perches on a dissonant, unresolved question, a diminished 7 chord. It just hangs there in the air. And rather than resolving that question mark, he extends the interrogatory tension for a full 17 bars into the third movement. And finally, it brings us back to this original pugilistic F minor that we began the piece in. Finally, we've arrived in the key of F minor, and yet he doesn't want to let us feel too much at home, and so he pushes us off of the downbeat, and in this next section, the downbeat feels as if it has been displaced to the second beat. We hear these gruff accents on the second beats. And just when we have submitted and we feel like, okay, the second movement, the second beat is now the first beat, he rips it back onto the first beat, which gives us this sense of metrical whiplash. There's a kind of thuggish quality to this. Nice little string quartet you've got here. Be a shame if anything happened to it. And then, from this stormy sea of anxiety, the middle section is much more pleading, it's placating, it feels like a prayer for relief. And from this stormy sea of anxiety, the last movement comes, and it is in a rondo, F minor, and it has this feeling of hauntedness, as if we are now in a state of extreme mental distress, really hovering on the edge of a complete nervous collapse. Feels like we're hanging on to sanity by our fingernails here. And then in one of the great about faces of all music history, the coda is not only in F major, but it's in a kind of Looney Tunes light F major. It reminds us in a way of what happened in the Egmont Overture that we heard excerpts from early on, in that it goes from dark, tragic F minor to more triumphant F major. Only this is even more extreme. I'll play you some of the coda. That's all, folks. You know, it's it's incongruously happy in the end of all of that anxiety and pain. And some music critics and writers over the last centuries have been puzzled by it, baffled. They've even considered it to be a mistake. One of those who thought it was a mistake was Vincent d'Indy, the French composer and theoretician who lived about 100 years ago. And he wrote, "One might imagine that some light Rossinian finale had strayed into this atmosphere of sustained beauty. We think that no interpretation could palliate this error of genius." Seems a little extreme to me. To me, it seems not like an error, but as an extreme manifestation of Beethoven's underlying philosophy that pain and suffering really are the flip side of the coin of redemption and of joy, and that you can't really have one without the other. And he expressed this philosophy directly in a letter that he wrote in 1815 to a friend of his, Countess Anna-Marie Erdődy. And he said, "We mortals with mortal minds are only born for sorrows and joys, and one might almost say that the most excellent among us only receive their joys through sorrows. It is the fate of mortals. But even here one's power should become manifest, to endure unconsciously and to feel one's nothingness, and so to attain to that perfection of which the Almighty through such means will deem us worthy." And we hear this progression from sorrow to joy in the F minor quartet. If you were at the first program, we heard it rather explicitly in the last movement of the A flat major piano sonata, and we will hear it again in the A minor string quartet, opus 132, which will be last on tonight's program. This piece was written in 1825 15 years after the piece that we just heard, and it occupies many of the same territories. And like the A-flat major piano sonata that we heard in the first program, it was composed in the wake of a severe, possibly life-threatening illness. He was in that spring feeling so bad that he called up his doctor at one point, Dr. Anton Braunhofer, and he said, "I am not feeling well, and I hope that you will not refuse to come to my help, for I am in great pain." And so Braunhofer showed up, and he examined him and issued what sounds like a reprimand in his conversation book. He wrote, "No wine, no coffee, no spices of any kind. If you want to get entirely well and live a long time, you must live according to nature." And he was feeling so much like perhaps he was going to die that he took the doctor's advice, left Vienna, went to the resort of Baden, drank natural milk, he breathed the fresh air, and he got better. And he was so relieved and so thankful that he altered the architecture of this quartet, which he was working on at that time. Originally, it was a 4-movement piece. Now it is a 5-movement piece, and the middle movement is an 18-minute piece, unlike anything else he had ever written, or anybody had ever written, which he called the Heilige Dankgesang, the Holy Song of Thanks. This piece begins in a mood of despair, brooding, ominous. Again, we have this thicket of minor seconds, which are overlapping in a quasi-fugal setting. I'll play you a little bit of the introduction. And this twisty, ominous music continues, and it builds in tension until finally the first violinist can't stand it anymore and runs off delivering one of these Edward Munchian screams, falling a couple of octaves and then coming back up. And if we examine that scream, we see that it really is just a highly embellished F going to an E natural, again, descending a half step. And so we begin to glean that, as with the F minor quartet that we just talked about, the signature interval of this one, perhaps we could call it the intervallic villain of this drama, is the minor second. And we hear it everywhere. In the opening theme of the exposition, he gives us this agitated A minor passage laced with all of these minor seconds, and also laced with jagged, agitated, dotted rhythms. And it doesn't move forward in a straight line. At a point, he suddenly pulls back on the reins and he gives us an adagio bar, and then it forges ahead again in an echo of that scream. And then from this dark cloud cover of anxiety, we break through the clouds. And in the second theme, we suddenly find ourselves sailing surprisingly through this clear blue F major sky. And so from these very contrasting themes, we see that, as with the F minor quartet, although this is a more expansive piece, the central issues of contrast still apply. And this first movement is very peculiar in its architecture. It drives musicologists nuts, this movement, because it gives us the exposition, and then we go into the development section, and it lasts a very short time before we find ourselves in another recapitulation, another exposition in the wrong key of E minor, and then he gives it to us in the correct key of E minor. And it's a very odd architecture, and in the end it just ends in this mood of pounding defiance in A minor. And the second movement is in A major, and it has the effect on us of being a kind of a steam valve to let out some of the pressure that has built up over that first long, dark A minor movement. And its first section is very simple in its construction. We have, coming up from the bottom in octaves in all of the instruments, a rising gesture which consists again of minor seconds and major thirds. And he couples that with a falling gesture, which is more polite, more bowing, and he puts these together in every conceivable way. And the middle section, the trio, is one of these ethereal, exquisite Beethovenian inspirations. And remember that this is the music of a composer who was, for all practical purposes, stone deaf when he wrote this. And he comes up with this ethereal sound. It is like some heavenly musette. You have this squeaky high notes up in the extreme upper register of the violin, and on the A string he sustains a drone, and then he is joined by the viola and the cello on the drone, and it feels like some kind of a heavenly hurdy-gurdy, perhaps. It's an astonishing texture. But if you like astonishing textures, you'll love the third movement. This is the Heilige Dankgesang. And if I can remember the entire translation of the title in English, it is the holy song of thanks from a convalescent to the Godhead in the Lydian mode. And he goes to the trouble of telling us that it is in this unusual Lydian mode, and so I think I should go to the trouble of telling you what that is, just briefly. If you imagine a keyboard on a piano, just the white keys going from F to F, as if it were an F major scale, this is what the Lydian mode sounds like. It's like a major scale, but it has a raised fourth degree. If that were an F major scale, it would have a B flat. This has a B natural. So it has the impression, it gives us this sense that it is a super major scale, a luminous major scale. And he combines this Lydian luminosity with an unnaturally, glacially slow tempo. We hear in what I would take to be a reflection of the opening bars of the piece. You remember those brooding, overlapping, quasi-fugal minor seconds. Here we have overlapping quasi-fugal notes, but they are a major sixth apart, very consonant interval. And we hear 8 quarter notes of what amounts to a prelude. They sound a little bit like a distant set of far-off bells. And then from there, he gives us the first of what are 5 statements of a Lydian chorale tune. And it is a chorale, but it is so slow that it really comes across more of just a static, ecstatic, ethereal texture. I'll play you the first of these chorale statements, and you'll see what I mean. this happens 5 times. And if this is a new piece to you, I would defy you to sing me back that melody. But I will play it for you in a sped up version, the 3rd and the 4th phrases of the chorale, and you will hear that it really is a chorale tune, albeit in the Lydian mode, of the sort that you might hear in a church service. But the fact that he plays it at this glacially slow tempo induces in the listener a kind of trance-like, otherworldly effect. It really brings us to the brink of another realm, this paradisiacal realm. And then, after this long alternation between the preludes and the half-note chorale themes, we come to a new section in D major, which he marks feeling new strength. And this is utterly different music. It is laced with trills in the violin and scales, and it's in 3/8, and it has a dancing quality to it. It seems to represent a much more earthly kind of joy. And this long movement goes back and forth between these static, ecstatic chorale tunes and these much more dancing, joyful D major sections. And each time it becomes a little bit more elaborate, and he gives us variations on what came before. There's a book by Aldous Huxley which is called Point, Counterpoint. And there's a point at which one of the characters, Maurice Spandrell, plays this movement for another character, and Aldous Huxley describes it very evocatively, this movement. And I thought I would just read you his description of the climax of this movement, because he says it better than I can. It was as though heaven had suddenly and impossibly become more heavenly, had passed from achieved perfection into perfection yet deeper and more absolute and almost passionate serenity. The miraculous paradox of eternal life and eternal repose was musically realized. From this high point, which takes about 15 minutes to attain, he comes down gradually to an absolute moment of ethereal calm. And then he plays one of these rude Beethovenian jokes on us. He goes back into the key of A major and gives us a little set piece, a little march, like something out of an operetta. And as with this 3rd movement of the Opus 95, he displaces the downbeat, so we're not quite sure whether the downbeat is the 1st or the 2nd beat. It's just a way of bringing us back down to earth in a hurry. And after this, he plunges directly into this shivering tremolando in the lower voices of the string quartet, and a rather vocal recitative in the violin. And this reminds us, for those of you who were at the first concert, that in his late pieces, he was often breaking down this distinction between purely instrumental and purely vocal music. We heard that in the last movement of the A-flat major sonata that we heard on the first program. We hear it perhaps most famously at the beginning of the fourth movement of the Ninth Symphony, which he wrote the year before he wrote this piece. You remember how it goes into the Ode to Joy with the vocal soloists, but there is a transitional section with just the cello section, which takes us from instrumental music to vocal music. And in this piece written just the next season after the Ninth Symphony, he does something very similar to that. And from here we go ahead into the exposition of the final movement, this rondo theme, which is back into the agitated, dark, A minor world that we were in at the beginning of the first movement. Same dotted rhythms, the same use of half steps. We hear them throbbing away in the second violin. And to point up another relationship with the Ninth Symphony, when he originally mapped out the Ninth Symphony, his concept was to have an entirely instrumental piece. And he had even devised a theme for the last movement of the piece in D minor, and it was this theme in that key of the piece. And then he decided to introduce the Ode to Joy and those transcendent variations upon it. And so he abandoned this D minor rondo theme, but then he thought better of it and transposed it into A minor and used it as the basis of this piece. And as we go through this movement, we come to a point where we have a compressed fugato, again consisting entirely of, or almost entirely, of this villainous minor second. And gradually the intervals get wider and the tempo gets faster, and we arrive in a cello-driven coda way up in the extreme upper register, and the music flips over into a triumphant A major and comes to a triumphant conclusion. So once again we have gone from dark, sorrowful key to a bright and triumphant and very happy key. Although as we near the end, you'll hear that that villainous minor second sticks out its tongue at us a few more times before the curtains fall. And so now we come to the reason that this concert is called Beethoven Reflected. 1827 was a rather transformative year for the young Felix Mendelssohn. He was trying out new things in his life. He was expanding his already unbelievably capacious mind by enrolling in the University of Berlin, where he studied philosophy with Hegel. He was enrolling in aesthetics courses and geography courses. It was the year that Beethoven died, his idol. He also lost a close friend of his, so there was sadness in this year. And it was also the year that he finally decided it was time to stop taking music lessons from Karl Zelter, who was this very formidable authoritarian gentleman who had been a profound influence on Mendelssohn from the age of 10 onward. He is the one who is credited with giving him such a thorough grounding in the music of Bach and Handel and Mozart and Haydn and all of these classics, although he was rather conservative as well and didn't really take kindly to his protege's interest in this late music of Beethoven, which was really considered to be the music of a madman, and people just simply did not understand this music. Zelter was also the head of a chorus, very highly respected chorus called the Berlin Singakademie, and Mendelssohn had been associated with this organization since about the age of 10 when he came in as a boy soprano. Later, he actually premiered the St. Matthew Passion with this organization. So he had this very strong association with this singing academy, and it was there that he met a lovely young girl, soprano in the organization, her name was Betty Pistor, and he fell in love with her. And in 1827, he expressed his love musically. He wrote a poem and then he set it to music, and he called it Frage, question. And I will play you the entire 2-minute song because it has some bearing on this A minor string quartet that he wrote at the same time.
Ist es wahr? Ist es wahr? Dass du stehst dort in dem Laubgang an der Weinwand meiner harrst und den Mondschein und die Sternlein auch nach mir befragst. Ist es wahr? Sprich, was ich fühle, das begreift nur, die es mitfühlt und die treu mir ewig bleibt.
When he had completed the A minor string quartet, he sent a copy of this song and the quartet to his friend Adolf Lindblad, who was a Swedish composer who had also studied with Carl Zelter, and he appended a note that said, "The song which I sent you with the quartet is its theme. You will hear it with its own notes in the first and last movements, and in all 4 movements you will hear its emotions expressed." And we do hear this song, this question posed in the first violin, Ist es wahr, in the A major prelude to this piece. And by using that question at the very beginning of this piece, he draws a rather clear parallel with the way that Beethoven begins the last movement of his final string quartet with another question, more existential, muss es sein? We'll deal with the ramifications of that question on the last program when we hear this piece, Transcendence. But by drawing attention, I think, to this parallel, he is telling us that this piece was inspired not only by his youthful love for Betty Pistor, but also by his youthful love for the late quartets of Beethoven. And we hear this reflected everywhere in this piece, particularly in the first theme of the exposition of this first movement, which begins with a descending violin scream and then goes off on an agitated A minor theme, which is laced with minor seconds and with dotted rhythms. Let me play it for you. And if that sounds subliminally familiar, it probably reminds you an awful lot of the beginning of the exposition for Opus 132, which we just talked about. almost interchangeable, these themes. When we get to the second movement, he has gone into the key of F major, warm, pastoral music. Really, it seems like another expression of his love for Betty Pistor. 3/4 time, a song without words, music in the lower portion of the string quartet, sometimes using doublings in the cello, which give it a larger than 4-voice texture, very warm. Let me just play it for you. In its tender emotions and in its texture and in its low in the string quartet scoring and in its song without wordiness. It reminds us, I think, a bit of the B-flat major, the cavatina from the B-flat major string quartet, Opus 130 of Beethoven. Now, later in this movement, we have a much more direct and obvious parallel with the fugal second theme from Opus 95. You will recall that it was in the melancholy key of D minor. It starts in the viola, it progresses to the second violin. It is completely constructed of minor seconds. The second theme of this second movement in Mendelssohn's quartet is in D minor. It is a fugue that starts in the viola and goes to the second violin. It is completely constructed of minor seconds. The following movement, the third movement, is in certain ways more purely Mendelssohnian. It starts with a nostalgic tune. It sounds like an old folk tune. And yet, thinking in terms of Beethoven's motivic processes, we notice that it bears, in the first three notes, a strong resemblance to that fugue theme that we just saw, because they both rise and fall by a morning minor second. And the trio section is even more patented Mendelssohnian, Midsummer Night's Dreamish, scherzo, gossamer, fairyland music. But even here, there are Beethovenian motivic processes at work. If we examine that theme that we just heard closely, you will begin to notice that it is really just the 78 RPM version of the 33 1/3 second verse of that questioning song that we heard early on. And then in a more obvious imitation of Opus 132, the last movement begins with this burst of shimmering tremolando and a recitative-like violin solo. Which reminds us very much of the beginning of the last movement of Opus 132. And then, as with Opus 132, we go back into A minor and this half-step laced, dotted rhythm laced music with very interactive components in the lower voices of the string quartet. Which is very similar to the rondo theme from the end of Opus 132, with the exception that that theme is in 3/4 and that one was in 4/4. And as with Opus 132, it ends up in A major. Although very different kind of A major. Here we come full circle from the very beginning. We started with that lovely hymn-like prelude. We end with that same prelude. We hear that question asked again in the first violin, is it true? And then we hear the entire last phrase, the last verse of Frage, and this time he ends by asking, is it true that Betty Pistor loves me and that she will remain eternally true to me? Es ist wahr. And in case you're wondering, the answer is no. Wasn't true. She didn't love him. She married somebody else 3 years later, much to his disappointment, which I think teaches us that in this life we can't have everything we want, even if we are Felix Mendelssohn. So go enjoy the concert, and thank you for coming.